I want to go to Jonathan Adler now. He is a constitutional law professor at Case Western Reserve University. Professor, always good to see you. I'd say it ain't over but the shouting in the Republican caucus, but today there was cussing and shouting and a lot of other stuff, I understand. It all involved that effort to give more power to Speaker Pro Tem Patrick McHenry and help from the Democrats. What is the public to make of all this drama?
Well, that the House ultimately has to decide how it wants to operate. And if they can't agree, then the House can't do the business that the people needed to do. It can't appropriate money. It can't address a continuing resolution. It can't address aid to Israel or Ukraine. It can't address national defense authorizations and things like that. In order for the House to operate, there either has to be a speaker or there has to be a speaker pro tem or acting speaker that's been given the authority to move ahead to schedule bills and have bills pass the floor. Under the Constitution, the House sets its own rules of its own proceedings. And so this is something the House has to figure out internally.
Professor, I'm curious because this is the first time in history we have ever been here. You're a teacher. You're on a college campus. What are your students telling you about what they're watching in Washington?
Well, I mean, certainly some of my students find this to be a bit disturbing. Their view is that, Congress is supposed to legislate. Legislating typically requires compromise and building a majority. It's about addition rather than subtraction. But given the nature of partisanship these days, we see in both parties folks on the outer edges of those parties not being willing to let folks in the middle build bipartisan consensus. And when you have a Congress that's only divided by a few votes, that doesn't work. If you had a congressional majority of 300 members of the same party, well, then it would look very different. But in a very closely divided House, you either have to be unified as a party or you have to be willing to make deals across the aisle. And right now, it doesn't seem that either is easy to do.
Do they feel that Congress has their back, is addressing their needs?
Hard to know. I mean, I do know I actually polled my students today about whether they were concerned about the lack of a speaker, and about 2/3 of them were. Both in terms of the business, but also, the speaker is supposed to be in the line of succession for the presidency. The speaker is a position mentioned in the Constitution. It's supposed to be ensuring that the House can operate. And it's a sort of a basic thing the House is supposed to be able to do. And given the nature of partisanship today, the House is having a hard time doing that.
Professor, today's brouhaha, if you will, had to do with those expanded duties for Patrick McHenry. The basic question, is that constitutional?
Yes. The Constitution says that there will be a speaker that the House chooses, but otherwise says that the House sets its own internal rules. So the House can decide how much power the speaker has or doesn't have. I mean, generally, the speaker has the authority to bring legislation to the floor, has a lot of authority over the proceedings, what comes up and what doesn't, and that certainly can affect outcomes. But those are all things that are within the House's control. The House has its own rules that it has adopted. It can modify those rules. It can also opt to suspend or not follow those rules in special circumstances. So this is really all up to what the House does, and that could include having a temporary acting speaker or speaker pro tem. All those sorts of proposals are entirely consistent with the Constitution. It's really a question of what the House wants to do.
Professor, this seems to be a fairly common problem for Republicans in the House. Looking at the list here, Gingrich, Boehner, another Ohio guy from where you are there, Ryan, and now McCarthy, and also now Jim Jordan, another Ohio guy. What is it about Republicans that they find themselves having so many problems doing this when the Democrats seem to have no problems getting the gavel to Nancy Pelosi so many times?
Well, I think part of the problem is that as the country's become more partisan, an approach to governing that the Republicans in Congress have adopted is what's often been referred to as the Hastert rule. And the idea is that the speaker should not allow things to come up for a vote that don't command a majority of the Republican caucus. And what that means is that folks on the wing can affect what comes up as opposed to folks in the middle. And usually in a legislative chamber, we tend to think that what the legislature does is going to be a function of the median legislator, the legislator in the middle, not the legislator on either end. And I think that approach to governing has over time resulted in greater tension. And at the same time, the reduction in the number of moderates has meant that it's harder for there to be a speaker that can both satisfy a majority of their caucus and actually pass the sorts of bills that need to get passed, bills that keep the government open, that appropriate money, and things of that nature. I should note, though, we've seen hints of a similar phenomenon occurring on the Democratic side with the Progressive Caucus, both in the House and Senate, over issues like permitting reform. So I worry that this is a sign of what we're going to see going forward in terms of the way Congress operates.
I thought you were going to tell me it had to do with Ohio State football. Jonathan Adler, professor at Case Western Reserve. Professor, thanks for being with us.